So this brings me to the work in Parliament. It's part of Chapter 5. I've held every major economic portfolio in our party in caucus, the opposition House Leader. I've been President Chair of the largest caucus in NDP history, all through 2011 to 2014. And so I believe profoundly that our work in caucus has to be supported and enriched by the opinions of our activists across the country. We have to make sure what we do in Parliament is reflective of what people are concerned about across the country. And so I believe profoundly we need to transform politics in this country by making sure that everything we do includes our activists, includes social movements and environmental movements, the labor movement, so that what we are doing is never in isolation. And I'll give you one key example of that. Canada-Colombia trade deal that we fought for 18 months, it held up for 18 months. We held up because on the ground, activists across the country were writing into Liberal MPs and Conservative MPs and pushing them away from forcing it through the House. These kinds of successes, as trade critic and as finance critic, as industry critic, I have seen when we engage the public and our activists. So I am proposing a transformation about how we work together as a movement. Which brings me to Chapter 6, the most important chapter. That's my family. My wife Lee May is a clinical audiologist. She works with deaf and hard of hearing children to make sure they're not left behind, that they're diagnosed, that they get the supports that they need. And in the school system you can understand, if a deaf or hard of hearing kid is not diagnosed and supported, they can lose years, important learning years, at a crucial time in their childhood development. She's passionate about it. And I miss her terribly. I miss Stefan, who is here, but I'm glad that this leadership actually allows me to spend some time with him. My parents, as Stefan's grandparents, Terry and Ruth Julian, are now 94 and 93. They live in our same neighborhood. And my wife Lee May is very supportive of them. These are blessings. And I won't deny to you that it's hard to be on the road as long, as often as we are, and I'd say all of the other candidates would probably say the same thing. But we are absolutely committed to the kind of change that needs to be brought and the kind of supports that we can bring to other families. So despite the fact that we're on the road and away from our families, we are galvanized by something bigger, and that is a vision of this country that will change how regular Canadians live and provide the supports that families need. So now I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about my vision of the things that I think need to be a priority. And I'll start off with the planet, and then talk about people, and then finish up by talking about the party. First, the planet. Climate change is undeniable, and we are seeing the impacts of that more and more every year. Billions of dollars of economic costs, thousands of lost jobs. For those reasons, I took at the beginning of this campaign the principled position that I oppose Mr. Trudeau's raw bitumen export pipelines. Kinder Morgan, Keystone, Energy East, I am opposed to them on principle. I believe fundamentally that as a country we need to make a shift to clean energy development. That when we see worldwide the countries that are building hundreds of thousands of jobs, it's because they're making these investments. We already know Canada is going to have to quadruple its energy production, clean energy, over the next decade. And so those investments need to be made now. We need to make sure that we're starting with the energy workers in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I announced that a few weeks ago in Regina, with the support of Aaron Weir, who's the local MP, that we make those investments to transition those workers now with training to ensure that we are building those jobs and that we are profiting from the virtually limitless potential for clean energy across the country. On the planet score, we cannot mess with this planet. There is no planet B. To paraphrase President Macron from France, what we really need to do is make our planet Earth great again. And so these are fundamental principles that I adhere to. Secondly, on people. We need to make real investments in Canadians, and that starts with a fair tax system. I endorse all of the provisions that Canadians for Tax Fairness have put out. They estimate about $30 billion that we can bring in annual tax benefits to the federal government that we can invest in people. And I endorse their plan And that's part of where I think our movement needs to go, endorsing these plans from the Clean Energy Network, from Canadians for Tax Fairness, building on the good work that those networks and those organizations are doing. So by building a fair tax system, we can afford to make investments. As I mentioned earlier, emergency housing plan for 250,000 units to be built over the next 2 to 3 years. Now that may sound like a lot, but after the Second World War, the house that I still live in and grew up in, 109 Glover Avenue in Westminster, drop by if you want a coffee if you're in Westminster, is one of those homes that was built back in the post-war era. 300,000 units. We didn't think about it. We didn't think, wow, gosh, that'll be some money we'll have to lay out. We just did it. And I'm proposing only the second most ambitious housing program in our nation's history. It costs us $7 billion a year to keep people on the streets. Let's use that money to build affordable housing and have the principle of housing first root over every single community. Secondly, we cannot build a more equal society, and we're seeing profound inequalities now, with 2 billionaires possessing as much wealth as 11 million Canadians, 30% of the Canadian population. We cannot build more equality and eradicate poverty without having access to education. And so what I have proposed and what I'm promoting is free tuition. We eliminate tuition fees for college, university, and trade school. We have precarious workers that are suffering enormously from the fact that there are no benefits accruing to them. There's the appalling story of Jason, who at the age of 25 has lost all of his teeth because he had no access to basic dental care. And so what I'm proposing is not only reinforcing pensions for precarious workers, not only moving to a $15 minimum wage federally, but also provincially, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but also putting in place a national pharmacare plan and basic dental care for every single Canadian. And we can afford to do this. We can't do this. For the minimum wage, often it has been said, well, provinces have jurisdiction, but there is the working income tax credit, and that can actually serve to supplement wages for people who are earning less than $15 an hour in provinces that refuse to put in place an adequate living wage. And so I proposed that as well. I've also laid out in Sudbury, I talked a bit about this. Who saw the Sudbury debate? A few of you? Yeah?
We had a party.
Oh, you had a party here?
Yeah.
Good, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And so in Sudbury I talked a bit about this program for national reconciliation, which starts with ensuring that we respond to the crisis in Indigenous communities. Horrific levels of suicide and mental illness and addiction. Up to 40%, 40 times the Canadian average. And so we need an emergency program as the first step for national reconciliation to guarantee mental health services, adequate education, adequate housing, and also ensuring drinkable water in First Nations communities right across. Also ensuring that we, with the Clean Energy Plan, are making those investments so that those communities can transition to clean energy. The second stage for reconciliation is ensuring that we are working with municipalities and provinces, police authorities, the judicial system, healthcare authorities, education authorities to implant and put in place every single one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, including supports for Indigenous languages and culture, because it has been proven Indigenous communities where there is a good and vast knowledge of their local language, it makes a huge difference in terms of the sustainability of the community and the prosperity of the community. So we have to put in place that national reconciliation. And we have to ensure that as a result of it, there is a sea change in the federal government and how we approach the federal government services right across the country. So the third element that I mentioned earlier is the party. And I talked earlier about our activists being involved in every step. Who here is sick and tired of getting nothing but fundraising emails from the federal government? Oh, okay, I understand that. We have such a depth of wisdom and understanding right across this country, and we need to use our activist base, galvanize our activist base as part of everything that we do, as a party, as a caucus, as a movement. And so I believe fundamentally we need to change that relationship. We need to reach out to social movements, as I mentioned, environmental movements, and the labor movement, and galvanize young activists, particularly in the environmental movement. They are not with our party right now because we've been, at best, ambiguous on issues like Kinder Morgan and energies. They are out there and they are active in the political system. We need to bring them in as part of an environmental shift for our party. And that is how we help to broaden our movement. And we need to believe passionately about diversity. I mentioned earlier about Canadians with disabilities. In my community as well, we have a very important activist base in the LGBTQ community. And Pride in New Westminster has grown from 30 people that were active in that first year, over 10 years, to last year, where over 30,000 people in New Westminster participated in Pride in New Westminster. That's the kind of inclusive community and inclusive country that we need to build. There is no doubt. And when we talk about diversity, Burnaby, New Westminster, or the riding name changed in the last election, so it's now New Westminster Burnaby. And New Westminster Burnaby, yeah, that's the federal government. We had to redo all our stationery. New Westminster Burnaby is the most diverse community in the entire country. Over 100 languages are spoken. 2/3 of the community are visible minorities and new Canadians. And so we need to harness that incredible energy and strength by reaching out right across to embrace the diversity of our country and to create that inclusive Canada that we all want to see. The final point I want to make before I throw it open to comments and questions, and I look forward to that, is 2019. We have a Prime Minister who has violated the public trust repeatedly. He's done the exact opposite of what he said that he would do. He talked about enhancing healthcare funding, he's cut it. He talked about saying no to pipelines, he's done the opposite. He made the commitment that 2015 would be the last first past the post-election. And we know in 2019, we will still have an undemocratic first past the post-election. But we can make this a referendum on broken promises, including the broken promise around proportional representation. And I'm convinced that Canadians across the length and breadth of this land will say no to Mr. Trudeau, and they will say yes to a bold new NDP that is actually going to change things in this country. I'm excited by that. I'm looking forward to that. And I'll conclude for the moment by saying thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions.